Hello Primary 5, welcome back in a new episode of our science curriculum. Today we have a new concept which is going to be the ecosystem, and in this concept we're going to be talking about really interesting lessons, and let's get started. Can you just tell me what does the cow eat from the following answers? I guess you might be looking for the grass. Okay, I totally agree with you, but here we have to answer another question. Why does the cow need to eat grass? We know that the cow eats the grass, but we need to know why it eats the grass. The answer of this question is in that the grass is one of the producers. What does it mean, producer? A plant produces its own food. We studied previously the plant creates their own food by the photosynthesis process. And the final thing that we have studied in the previous episode was converting the plant sunlight energy into chemical energy. So this chemical energy is stored inside the grass. The other living organisms need to get their energy, but they cannot make photosynthesis process. And somehow they need to get their energy by eating something. So the cow eats the grass to get the energy. So that's correct answer. The next example that I have for you here is the tiger. Do all animals need to eat? Okay, maybe they all need to eat. But are all of them eating the same kind of food? That's the question that you have to think about it. Does the tiger eat grass? That's a problem. The tiger doesn't eat grass. This is not the favorite kind of food for the tiger. It's not a grass eater. So the tiger might be looking for a source of energy, but it's not gonna be a grass. But how to solve this problem? The energy is stored here in the grass, and the tiger doesn't eat grass. So the tiger might be looking for an animal, eats the grass, so the energy moves from the grass to this animal, and the tiger eats this animal, which is the deer in front of you, to get the energy. If your answer was the deer, that's correct answer. The next example that I have for you here is the lion. That happens with all animals wherever they live. So the lion here might be looking for a source of energy. And the lion, like the previous example, it doesn't make photosynthesis process. So how could the lion get the energy? Actually, not by photosynthesis process. They cannot. But maybe by eating one of these examples. So which animal here lives in the same habitat with the lion, and it could be suitable meal, and it could be a delicious meal for the lion. So the lion eats this animal to get the energy. If your answer was the zebra, that's correct answer. Even the aquatic creatures are looking for a source of energy. The shark is one of the living organisms that live in oceans, seas. They might be looking for a source of energy. Can they eat grass? Actually, they are not grass eaters. So they might be looking for one of these animals to eat. So which one of them is suitable for the habitat that the shark lives in? I guess your answer is correct. If it's the fish, give yourself a big hand. Perfect. In the previous examples, we have studied that the animals need to eat something to get the energy. All of living organisms except the plant, because it's the producer. All of living organisms need the energy, but the way is different. The producers, like the plant, produces their own food by themselves through the photosynthesis process. But the other living organisms are not producers. Produce their own food using the sunlight and the carbon dioxide. They might be looking for something to eat, then they get the energy. So it seems like all of the previous examples start by the same item. Starts by a producer, a plant or a part of the plant, which makes its own food to store the energy inside. And all animals need the energy to get their own food. So a grass eater might eat the plant to get the energy. So when they eat the producer, the energy moves from the producer to this animal. In this case, this animal must be named as a consumer. The word consumer means gets the energy by eating. So this animal consumes the energy from the food. It takes the energy from the food. This is what's meant to by a consumer. So any animal eats the plant is known as a consumer. Okay, so the energy moves from the producer to the consumer. Another animal here, which is the fox. The fox needs to get the energy, and the fox doesn't need to eat plant. So the fox here needs energy, This energy cannot be consumed by the plant directly because the fox is not a grass eater. So how does the fox get the energy? I guess by eating this animal. So the energy first moves from the plant to be stored in this animal. Then the energy moves from this animal to another animal. In this case, this animal going to be another consumer. So a consumer and a consumer. So how to differentiate between them? Look here, this arrow represents the energy flow. The energy moves from the plant to this animal, which is right now known as a consumer. And here, another consumer. So if we have two consumers, which one of them starts getting the energy? If it's this one, this is gonna be primary consumer. The primary consumer becomes first. The next one, which is another consumer, going to be the second one. In the sequence, in the arrangement, this is going to be the second one. So in such case, we call this animal a secondary consumer. So a producer, primary consumer, and secondary consumers are the basic parts, the basic items to form an energy chain. Why do we call that an energy chain? Because actually they are connected together by the flow of the energy. Like the chain, many items are connected together, but what connects them together here is the energy flow. It passes from this one to this one, and from this one to this one. So they are connected like the chain. And the feeding relationship between them controls the movement of the energy by the energy flow. So the energy chain here means a flow of the energy from a living organism to another living organism to a third living organism. But these living organisms are different: producer, primary consumer, and secondary consumer. The next activity here shows another foodie chain, another flow of the energy from a living organism to another one. So let's start by the grass. The grass here makes photosynthesis, so it takes the energy of the sun. So it converts the light energy that is coming from the sun into chemical energy stored inside. Then a grasshopper comes to eat the plant to get the energy. Then the rat or the mouse eats the grasshopper or some insects to get the energy. In this case, we call this a producer because it produces its own food. And this is the primary consumer because it's the first one after the grass in the foodie chain. So the grasshopper here becomes the primary consumer. Then the rat or the mouse becomes the secondary consumer. But the foodie chain here has a missing member. It's gonna be one of these two members, either the owl or the frog. So which one of them do you think going to be here? Which one of them comes after the mouse or the rat or eats this team member? Or gets the energy from the secondary consumer that comes after the secondary consumer here? Perfect. If your answer was the owl, that's correct answer. But here we have a problem. If this one a producer, primary consumer, and secondary consumer, what do we call the owl here right now? It becomes after the secondary consumer. So it's the third one. We call this tertiary consumer. Tertiary consumer. So here one more time, a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and the tertiary consumer, which comes after the secondary consumer. Anyway, the grasshopper gets the energy from the grass, so the energy flows from the grass into the grasshopper. Then the energy flows from the grasshopper into the rat. Then it moves from the rat into the owl. So we have here an energy flow, so we have an energy chain. First exercise that we have together going to be find the missing item. Find the missing in the foodie chain. Here we have the carrot. It represents a producer, which is a plant. Then the primary consumer is not there. The missing primary consumer going to be one of these two answers, either the rabbit or the wolf. Finally, we have the fox, which is here represented by a secondary consumer. You might be thinking about two main ideas. The first idea, if I have a plant and I have a predator here, a predator like the fox, so the missing item which is going to be here represents a prey. An animal could be the prey of the fox. And in this case, you might be looking for rabbits because they are preys of fox. The second idea which might come up in your mind here, I have a producer and I have the secondary consumer. So what's the missing primary consumer? I'm looking for not just a prey, I'm looking for a primary consumer. A primary consumer means grass eater. So which one of them is a grass eater? I guess your answer is correct. If it's the rabbit, give yourself a big hand. Another exercise comes here, which is really interesting exercise. In front of you there, a foodie chain. But it seems like there is something wrong there. There is something wrong in this foodie chain. Would you please think with me, what is the mistake? Maybe here, but actually that's the grass. It's supposed to be at the beginning because that's the producer, it comes first. Maybe the rabbit, but the rabbit is a grass eater. So the rabbit is considered a primary consumer. No problem in the existence of the rabbit as a primary consumer. The next one here is the fox. The fox represents a secondary consumer. So I guess the problem not in the location or the sequence of the foodie chain. Maybe we have to look at these arrows. Look at them. Do you think these arrows represent the correct flow of the energy from a living organism to another within this foodie chain? So the arrows here point to the wrong direction. The energy flow starts in the grass and it goes to the rabbit. So the arrow must be looking there. This arrow is wrong as well. So let's click to reveal the answer. We're gonna find it, the arrow's direction. The direction of the arrows was the mistake in this activity. Let's pass to the next level. The next level here is a little harder. So let's think together how to solve it. I have here Laris as a representation of the producer, rabbit, finally owl. Then Laris again, slug, and finally owl. Maybe the problem is in the arrows. No, I guess the arrows pointing to the correct direction. The flow from the Laris to rabbit, from the rabbit to owl, from the Laris to slug, from the slug to owl. Okay, I guess I catch what's wrong here. I guess you catch what's the mistake. You might be thinking about the main components of the foodie chain. The foodie chain starts with the producer, then a primary consumer, then a secondary consumer. So no problem here in the flow of the first energy chain. But you know what's wrong? It's not an energy chain. That activity represents two foodie chains together. So it's not a foodie chain. Let's click to reveal the answer here. We have here more than one producer and more than one primary consumer. So this is not a foodie chain. The third one is a little easier. In front of you here, representation of a foodie chain. It starts by a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. Would you please highlight what is the mistake here? Can you just find out? I guess this one is a little easier than before. You know why? Look here, that's fish. Is it a producer? Do fish produce their own food by taking the sunlight, carbon dioxide, and performing the photosynthesis process? So actually that's the mistake. So when we click to reveal the answer here, we're gonna find this is not a producer. Give yourself a big hand. Welcome back, Primary 5 Superheroes. Right now we're gonna be talking about the ecosystem, the meaning of the ecosystem. We have studied in the previous episodes that we have foodie chain for many living organisms. Whoever they are, wherever they live, the place that contains all of the living organisms known as ecosystem. But to name this place an ecosystem, it must contain two things. The first item represented in the living organisms, producers, consumers, whoever they are. The next thing included in the ecosystem must be non-living things. For example, the producers are dealing with the sunlight, carbon dioxide. These are not living organisms. The sunlight, the carbon dioxide, water, the area around, those are non-living items. So the ecosystem, the place where living organisms and non-living things interact with each other. It's the place that contains living organisms and non-living things. Right now, we're gonna represent some foodie chains in different ecosystems and different habitats. Let's start by this one. There in front of you, some images of different living organisms. We need to build up our own foodie chain using them. we need to use them to build up the food chain in this ecosystem. You might be looking for the oak tree. This is gonna be the first thing because it's the producer. So what comes after the oak tree? You might be looking for the grass eater, which is the primary consumer. And I guess you might be thinking it's going to be the oak worm because it's the only one able to eat the oak tree leaves here. The second one going to be the secondary consumer, which is going to be the blue tit. The blue tit is a bird, eats the oak worm, and definitely different kinds of worms. This is just an example. And finally, we have the sparrowhawk. It's going to be the final consumer here, or the tertiary consumer. So the food chain is made up of a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and finally the tertiary consumer, which is represented there by the hawk. Two pieces of information are really important about the hawk. It's really special bird because the hawk doesn't eat plant at all. It's one of the special animals who are feeding on meat only, who are feeding on animals only. So the hawk is really special because it feeds on animals, birds. Something really special about the hawk. Let's move to the next food chain. The next ecosystem that we have is different. We have here some food chain members and we need to classify them. Would you help me? Let's get started. The first thing is the grass. It must be at the beginning of any food chain. Okay, right now we are looking for the primary consumer that's supposed to be number 2 here. So which one of them do you think, the frog or the slug? I guess you might be looking for the slug. It makes sense, the frog going to be the third one and the final one going to be the owl or the eagle owl. So this ecosystem has different animals, has different food chain, but anywhere we can find the ecosystem including living organisms and non-living things together. The next one going to be the marine ecosystem. The ecosystem not just on land, even with the aquatic creatures. What surrounds the aquatic creature is considered an ecosystem. So here we go. We start the food chain of this ecosystem, which is found under the water surface by the producer. The producer here must be something green. A living organism has the ability to capture the sunlight and perform a photosynthesis process, but the plant is not present there. We might be looking for a replacement, and this replacement is going to be the green algae. The algae going to be the producer of this marine ecosystem. What comes after the algae is a grass eater. So a primary consumer from the following, I guess it's going to be the shrimp. Perfect. The following one, which is going to be the secondary consumer here, it's something eats the shrimp. So the energy flows from the shrimp to the cod or the kind of fish that are considered prey for the bigger fish. After that, we are looking for the seal. And finally, the white shark, which is a top predator here. Successfully, we made the food chain of the marine ecosystem by algae, shrimp as a primary consumer, the fish or the small fish that are considered the secondary consumer here. So the energy moves from the shrimp or flows from the shrimp to the fish. Then the energy flows from the fish, which are considered secondary consumer, into the following one. Here, that's the tertiary consumer. And finally, the white shark, which is the top predator or the final consumer. That's here is considered the final consumer because the food chain ends here. You might notice that from the previous activities, the food chains are not the same everywhere in the content. They might be different in the content, but all of them have the same categories. Every food chain starts with the producer. Whoever is this producer or whatever is this producer. Then the turn comes for the primary consumer. The primary consumer is different from food chain to another according to the ecosystem, according to the environment around. But anyway, we have a primary consumer. After that, the turn comes for the secondary consumer, which is different from an ecosystem to another one. But anyway, it's present. The final consumer or the tertiary consumer is different from a place to another. But any food chain is connected by main labels: producer, consumers. They are divided into primary, secondary, and the tertiary consumer, and every food chain is represented by the flow of the energy, which is represented by the arrows. That shows you that the energy moves from this living organism to this living organism. Or it shows you this living organism feeds on this living organism, then the energy moves from this one to the following one. Another important part you have to keep in mind, the questions might come up with a different criteria. Sometimes I'm not going to ask you, what does this animal represent? This primary consumer maybe is considered a primary consumer, but it's a prey in the same time because this animal feeds on it. So here that represents a prey. The following part here speaks about this animal. I know it's the secondary consumer, but it's considered predator for this animal and a prey for this animal. So the secondary consumer in most of food chains is represented by predator and prey. It's a predator for the primary consumer and a prey for the tertiary consumer. Finally, we have the tertiary consumer, which is considered here a predator only. So these are main important parts to answer some questions. Just keep them in mind. This is another activity for you. You need to make the same in this activity like what we have done in the previous activity. You need to label these living organisms, which one of them is a producer and which one of them is a consumer, and which kind of consumer is that, is it primary, secondary, tertiary, and which one of them is the prey, and finally which one of them is the predator or prey and predator in the same time. You can stop the video right now, think about them, and then play the video again. If your answers were like that, producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary and quaternary consumer, your answers are correct. But don't forget, we have another task. This one is a producer only. The shrimp here represents a primary consumer, but it's a prey for the following one. This one is predator and prey in the same time. It feeds on shrimp. So this is going to be a predator for the shrimp, but prey for the seal. And the seal is considered the predator for this one, but it's a prey for the white shark. And finally, the white shark represents a predator only. This activity might be a little different, but it's a little easier. In front of you, a complete food chain for every environment there, for every ecosystem there. But the ecosystems are not labeled. So we need to locate these food chains within these ecosystems. You might be thinking about the first one for a while, then the second one for a while, the third one as well. Stop the video, think about which ecosystem is supposed to be the ecosystem of each one of them, then play the video again to reveal your answers. And now let's reveal our answers together to make sure they are correct. I guess the following one here contains animals live in a woodland. They live in a place or an ecosystem like the forest. I recommend it's gonna be the broadleaf woodland. The second one is really obvious. It matches the coral reef ecosystem. And the final one must be the savanna. So let's check our answers together. Perfect, you did a great job. When it comes to real life, if we looked to any ecosystem around the world, we might not find energy chain only. Have you ever asked yourself, do we have only one food chain in the real ecosystems, whatever they are? For example, the Arctic ecosystem or the Arctic region or the polar climate, do we have here just one food chain, only one producer, only one primary consumer, only one secondary consumer? I guess the matter is a little different in real life, but it matches what we have studied because the food chain is present actually, but we have many food chains in the same ecosystem. So here we're going to study a new concept which is going to be food web. If we have more than one food chain in the same place, they complete the life requirements for each other. It's going to be food web. So the food web shows many different feeding relationships between many animals in the same ecosystem. That can be seen obviously in the Arctic ecosystem or the woodland ecosystem, the desert ecosystem. Look, we have many animals, many feeding relationships. We have many animals we have many feeding relationships between all of these animals. The rainforest ecosystem, it's full of feeding relationships between all animals there. So we don't have just one food chain. We have many food chains. Together they form the food web. Even in the Rocky Mountains, look there, you're gonna find more than food chain can be connected together. When they are connected, that shows you the food web. So the food web in any ecosystem contains more than one producer, more than one primary consumer, and more than secondary consumer. It's full of animals. Even in the desert food web, the energy flows from more than one producer to more than one primary consumer to more than one secondary consumer. So it's full of animals and full of energy chains, and they are all connected together. So look here, the energy flows from this to this, or from this to this. So the energy flows from this producer to the primary consumer, or from this to the primary consumer. So it seems here like the animal has more than one food resource to feed on it. And that actually makes the food web more stable than the energy chain. So the food web is more stable than the energy chain. Why? Just think about it. Give me reason for that. Just give reason for it. Why the food web is more stable than the food chain? Let's compare between them. Here is the comparison. This figure represents a food chain and this figure represents a food web. Would you tell me please what happens here if the deer disappears? I guess you might be thinking about something horrible going to happen. I guess you might be thinking about the lion. The lion here will not find something to eat. So all lions in this ecosystem will die. They will not find food to eat because there is no replacement for the deer. But look in the food web. What happens, for example, here if the rabbit disappeared? I guess all animals there will find replacement. For example, if the rabbit disappears, I guess the eagle here doesn't depend necessarily on the rabbits only. We have many replacements. That's why we have food web, which is made up of more than energy chain, all of them connected together, and that makes the ecosystem more stable. That actually makes the food web more stronger, and it makes the ecosystem which has the food web more stable than the ecosystem that has food chain. But to make sure about the food web stability and the ecosystem stability, we have just to add extra thing here, which is going to be protectors. Two groups of living organisms. They ensure the stability of the ecosystem. For example, the first kind of living organisms responsible for the stability of the food web and the ecosystem at all, known as scavengers. The scavengers are animals like hyenas, cockroaches, houseflies, vultures, and etc. These animals or these living organisms are highly important because you might not ask yourself that before. What happens when all living organisms in the food web die? If all of the dead bodies remain in the ecosystem, that destroys the ecosystem. That makes the ecosystem full of dead bodies. So the scavengers are really useful because they start decomposing the dead bodies. They feed on the dead bodies, the remains of the dead bodies of all living organisms when they die. They start this process, but they didn't end it. Who ends this process? Actually, another group of living organisms known as decomposers, which decompose and break down. As you see here, they are responsible for breaking down the dead bodies into very, very, very small pieces. They feed on some of them and they leave the rest in the soil. When they leave the rest in the soil, the plants feed on them later on. These are the nutrients that the plant needs for itself. So thank you, decomposers, for saving the ecosystem for us. Thank you for making our food web stable. So we have to say thanks for decomposers because they recycle or decompose the dead bodies of the living organisms into the ingredients or the small particles that the plant can feed on later on. Then the plant grows up to be a producer, and then the primary consumer comes to eat it, then the secondary, then the tertiary, and all of the dead bodies and all of living organisms when they die going to be broken down into smaller pieces by the effect of the scavengers first and then the decomposers next. The scavengers start feeding on the dead bodies. Once they did, the scavengers start eating them. But the scavengers do not eat them all. They start just breaking down into smaller pieces. Then the turn comes for the decomposers. They break down into very small pieces. They eat some of them, then they leave the rest in the soil. This is why the soil becomes fertile, full of nutrients, because actually the decomposers effect is really useful for the stability of our ecosystem. Some of the examples about the decomposers like bacteria, slugs, mushroom, and snails. So finally, these are the soldiers who are protecting our ecosystem and keeps life goes on. Maybe you didn't see before what happens to food or animals when they die carefully, but look here, that's the effect of the decomposers on the living organisms when they die. They decompose it into very small pieces. They eat some of them and they leave the rest for the soil. And look here, that what happens actually, and that's the effect of the bacteria and the fungi on the living organism's body. They decompose them. Decompose means breaking down them totally into tiny and smaller ingredients will be found in the soil as a food for the plant later on. But it doesn't necessarily mean the food that the plant creates for itself. It is just the nutrients that will be soluble in the water that the roots of the plant absorbs. So the effect of the decomposers is really useful for the stability of the food chain and the food web and finally our ecosystem. As usual, I prepared many gifts for you. I hope you like it. This is the first one. Here we have a zigzag book, but it's empty. And here are some stickers about animals or living organisms will be labeled here. All you have to do is just to cut them, then stick them here, then fold this zigzag book along the dotted lines here. Finally, you're going to be receiving a face of a line contains inside your own food chain. Just don't forget when you finish this activity to take a picture for the final product and send it back to me to receive more gifts. The next activity that I have for you as a homework is to cut and stick. In front of you here labels. They are empty. And here is your food chain. It already exists completely, correctly, no problem in the food chain. But you have to label these items. You have to label these names here correctly. When you finish, just send it back to me to correct it for you. If they were all correct, you're going to be receiving a huge gift. The last thing before you go, make like and subscribe to my YouTube channel to receive more gifts and more amazing games. See you the next time and goodbye.